Ladies and gentlemen, and can I welcome you all to today's meeting of the Public-Petitions-Committee. And as always, can I ask everyone to switch off their mobile phones and electronic devices, as it does interfere with our sound system. And I hope that the wind doesn't interfere too much with our sound system. Unfortunately, there's not much I can do with that today. Apologies have been received from Adam Ingram, and on sheer behalf of all the committee, we wish him all great recovery from his recent illness, and I'm sure the clerk will drop him a line on that front. And can I welcome Maureen Watt, who's the substitute member, who's attending her first committee as Adam Ingram's substitute, and I welcome Maureen to our committee today. Agenda item 1 is declaration of interests. The first item is the declaration of interest by Maureen Watt, and in accordance with section 3 of the Code of Conduct, I invite Maureen Watt to declare any interests relevant to the remit of the committee.
Thank you very much, Convener. I can't think of any specifically, but obviously if there's a petition that I think there is some related interest, I will of course say so.
Thank you very much. Agenda item 2 is decision on taking business in private. The next item of business seeks the committee's agreement to take items 7 and 8 in private. Is the committee agreed that these items be taken in private? Thank you. I move then to agenda item 2, consideration of current petition. The next item of business is consideration of PE 1383 by Helen McDade on behalf of the John Muir Trust on better protection for wild land. As previously agreed, the committee will take evidence from Andrew Thinn, who's the chairman, and Ian Jardine, the chief exec of SNH, and members of a note by the clerk and the submissions. And can I welcome both our witnesses to the committee, particularly Mr. Thinn is a well-kent face, so I'm very glad to see you both today. Thank you for coming along. Can I invite Mr. Thinn to make a short opening statement of around 5 minutes. I'll kick off with a few questions, and then my colleagues will do some follow-up. Mr. Thinn.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, can I start by asking if you would please note for the record that at one time I was a member, trustee, and indeed chairman of the John Muir Trust. I resigned all those positions some years ago, and I had nothing to do with this petition, but I just want to record that. We're here to answer your questions, so I really only want to make 4 brief introductory points. First, I want to apologise to the committee for the time it's taken to progress the wildland mapping. I'm sorry about that. It's been fiendishly complicated. We've been trying to map something that's never been mapped before, and we've been trying to use a methodology that's novel and innovative, and it has simply taken longer than we thought. In parallel to working with you and with the John Muir Trust on that, we've also been responding to detailed requests from the Scottish Government as part of the refreshing of Scottish planning policy and national planning framework, work that's still ongoing. So thank you for your patience. I apologise, and I apologise to John Muir Trust too, who have also been exceedingly patient with all this. Secondly, I want to agree with the inference in the petition that what the John Muir Trust calls wild land is a hugely important resource for Scotland. It's important for tourism. A lot of people come here because it's there. It's an integral part of the brand value of a lot of our, that sells a lot of our food and drink sectors. You just need to look at packaging on some kinds of smoked salmon, look at the packaging and labels on some of our whisky exports. It's hugely important for recreation, gets an awful lot of people out every weekend. And as a consequence of that, it's actually quite important in skills retention in Scotland. You'd be surprised how many people in the financial sector work in Edinburgh rather than London because of access to that land. And actually, I think a lot of people feel that it's an integral part of our national identity. So, no problem agreeing with the inference, but I think we need to be clear what we're talking about. Scotland's a managed landscape that's evolved over thousands of years. There are actually probably no or very few areas of anything that you could call natural wilderness. And one person's wild land is another person's place of work. I think we need to remember that. So what SNH is focusing on is the quality that people experience as wildness or wildland character, and on protecting that. If you take 100 people for a walk into the Scottish Hills, there'll be very little consensus at all as to when you've crossed a line into wild land. But there may be rather more agreement, I think, if you talk about the sense of transition that's experienced through degrees of wildness, that experiential sense. Thirdly, I want to acknowledge the petition's focus on what the John Muir Trust terms the best areas of wildland, because I think it is these major areas of wildland character that are of greatest national importance. And it's certainly these that provide us with what in European terms is a relatively unique selling point as a country. That's not to say, however, that there's not countless small and locally important opportunities to experience wildness all around Scotland, including close to our urban settlements. And these are important too, but they may well be better protected through local planning policies. And of course, SNH is happy to and does advise local authorities on the identification and, if appropriate, the protection of those local areas. And fourthly and lastly, I want to question the petition's assumption that a new national statutory environmental designation is the best way of protecting this resource. There may be other more effective ways of achieving the same objective. We need a planning mechanism that can recognise the gradation of experience that we're talking about and that can accommodate the fact that not all activities or developments will have a significant impact on wildness. This is not, I think, and contrary to some media commentary, to be confused with the issue of intervisibility indicators and what can be seen from any given place. It's about impact on an experiential quality. Scottish planning policy and the current national planning framework, SPF2, already recognise the importance of safeguarding areas of wildland character in Scotland. And the primary focus of our work has been and continues to be on ensuring the effectiveness of those policies so that they work well for everyone. At the end of the day, this must be about facilitating good developments in the most appropriate places. And that requires a policy tool that's clear for all, that's effective in its intended purpose, and that avoids unintended consequences. So thank you for inviting us. We'll do our very best to respond to your questions. This is a very significant area of work for us.
Thank you much, Mr. Thin. I've got a couple of questions and obviously invite Ian Jardine to come in at any stage that he wishes. I suppose the first thing I'd perhaps like you to clear up was a confusion in my own mind. The Minister, as you know, has said that he's not persuaded that there's a case for a new statutory designation of wild land. But you'll probably be familiar as well that some of the tabloids have reported the First Minister saying that wind farms may be banned from wild land. Surely that would need some form of designation.
No, I don't think it would need a designation. No, a designation is clearly an option. I'm questioning whether it's the best option. It wouldn't need a designation. Planning policy is an equally effective tool for controlling different types of development.
And are you quite comfortable that there's clear and absolute definition of what we mean by wild land?
Well, I'm going to turn to Ian because we've done an awful lot of work on this, but clearly an experiential quality is exceedingly hard to define. Ian, tell us where we've got to.
Yeah, and I think one of the facts, in all of this, to just be honest about, is there is no single national or international definition of what we mean by wild land. So the work that we've been doing in terms of mapping, we have to be very clear. We can only map things that can be mapped. And that is, therefore produces, if you like, a proxy. These are things that are associated with the sense of wildness that people talk about, remoteness, lack of visibility of structures, that kind of thing. We can map those and that produces a map. The view of what is then wild land, I think, requires some degree of consensus and agreement, probably at a political level, that, yes, that's the thing we want to protect. But we can't offer you a clear definition that says that is and that isn't. A lot of it is to do with perceptions. So sooner or later, somebody takes decisions about, for us, this is what we mean, and this is what we're going to do about it.
Yeah, I think that was the point I was making to Andrew Thin. This seems a bit of a vague area. I mean, we've got 2 national parks. Obviously, the definition of that, the boundaries are defined. But can I ask you, Mr. Jardine, a technical question? I understand that there is an indicator, the N3 indicator, which shows Scotland, which is visually unaffected by built development, but this has not been publicly produced since 2010. Could you perhaps explain why this is not currently available?
Yes, I can't, although I'd be happy to write with all the technical information. We have had technical problems with updating that indicator. One thing I'd like to emphasize is that is a different indicator to the wild land or wildness indicator. It's simply looking at visibility. So it's one of the things that we've used in looking at how you might define wild land, but it's not the only thing. As I say, I can't do all the technical details, but we have had technical problems in using some of the data on visibility and transferring that into a mapped form so that you can then map it. We will have that information. We will be able to produce that later this year. At the moment, I'm told it'll be something like June before we have that available.
I mean, many constituents for all of us have written recently, not least because of this petition, and have argued that the development of wind energy is the main threat to Scotland's wild land. What's your view on that?
I think it's at the moment, obviously, it's one of the significant developments that's affecting wild land, that's affecting landscape issues across the country. And as we all know, difficult decisions are being taken about what should be permitted in terms of promoting the government's energy policy against where some developments might be going too far, and therefore decisions would be taken not to allow them. I think one thing in looking at the wild lands, though, issue is that we don't get entirely obsessed by wind energy. It's not the only issue. There are other kinds of development, and the impact of those developments varies. So again, it's not often a black and white issue. There are issues such as upland tracts, which have been in the media as well, that affect wild land. But different types of development have different types of impact, and people experience and feel differently about them.
Mr. Thin, do you still comment further?
No.
All right. Can I pass over to Chick Brodie?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Thin, Mr. Jordan. There's no such thing as wild land, is there, Mr. Thin?
Well, I was very careful to say it's wildness. It's an experiential quality. It's the experience that people have that's wild. It's not the land that's wild.
If I may just go back, when you gave evidence to another committee on which I sit, you said that you thought we were talking at cross purposes, and I quote, "First, let me be clear that Scotland is an entirely man-made landscape." And you repeated, "Scotland's entirely man-made landscape or a people-made landscape, to be clear." So we're having this discussion with this, and it's already been clear this morning, that we can't define what wild land is, and therefore we're trying to square a circle, aren't we?
No, I don't think so. Scotland is entirely a man-made landscape or a people-made landscape. There is no question that has been made by people over thousands of years. There is almost nothing that is pristine wilderness in Scotland. That's clear. But we're not talking about wilderness, so let's be clear about that. We're talking about the experience that people have in certain parts of Scotland, which they describe as experiencing wildness. So we're talking about wild. I mean, I prefer the term in Scottish planning policy, which is wild land character, which I think is much more helpful than the concept of wild land. And that's why I made it clear that I'm not sure that you can simply draw lines on maps and say that's wild land and that's not, because it is a gradation.
Okay. I wonder if I can then, on that basis, and I'm still confused, but on the basis of look at the University of Leeds report of 2010, the report stated that in Scotland, effort to safeguard wild land is focused on maintaining the qualities that are valued for recreational use. It then goes on to say, areas of wild land character in some of Scotland's remoter upland, mountain and coastal areas, are very sensitive to any form of development or intrusive human activity. Who defined? I mean, on one side we're saying it's okay for recreational use, but there shouldn't be any invasion of human activity to impact on wild land. I mean, again, how do we reconcile these views? How did the report even attempt to reconcile these views?
Well, I find that a difficult definition from Leeds University, because actually the vast majority of Scotland is also somebody's workplace. If you're a stalker or a keeper, then it's your place of work. Some people might consider that an invasion, depending on their perspective, that's an invasion of the so-called wild land. Well, that is possible, but what is clear is that Scottish planning policy, as it stands, states that we should protect wild land character or wildness. Now, that in no sense precludes many activities.
Can I ask, when we talk of wild land, one of the issues that we discussed in another committee was land registration. Who owns the wild land that you're currently mapping? And can you tell me when the mapping is going to be complete?
Scotland is owned by a lot of different people. Off the top of my head, I can't tell you how much of the wild land, insofar as...
Owners don't wish it to be categorised as wild land.
Well, planning policy of any kind doesn't necessarily take that into account. I mean, planning policy applies to land whoever owns it. So the question of who owns it is not necessarily a matter for planning policy.
Well, let me ask one very direct question. It's already been asked. It's got nothing to do with the definition of wild land, has it? This has grown because of the development of wind energy. Isn't that the case?
Wind energy is one of the planning challenges that Scotland has to tackle effectively at the moment and over the next few years. But it's only one of a number of challenges. We need an effective planning system, whatever the developments are that are coming forward.
I don't think you answered the question. When do you think the mapping of the wild land will be complete?
Well, the mapping is completed, and that's why we're here.
Okay, thank you.
Angus MacDonald. Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Sin. Good morning, Mr Jardine. Mr Sin, you mentioned in your introductory remarks the responsibilities of local authorities, and you've just mentioned the need for an effective planning system. It's been my experience that planning authorities, and in particular planning committees, can depart from their local plans sometimes with no rhyme nor reason. Indeed, planning officers' recommendations often do not give due weight to wild land, which is contrary to the national importance given to it under NPF 2 and the Scottish Government's Scottish planning policy. So I'm curious as to whether SNH consider current policy to be adequate protection for wild land, and how do you think your work should be incorporated into the future or the forthcoming NPF 3 and the Scottish planning policy?
I'll say something about that. I mean, obviously, the timing at the moment with the consultation on revisions to SPP and NP3 is very much in our minds in looking forward on this. I mean, what we're looking at essentially, I think, is a way to help to inform the revision of SPP and NP3 to try and make it more effective and to ensure that the government's policy intentions are adequately reflected and I suppose, if possible, to improve the way that that operates. So a lot of the mapping work is building on what the existing Scottish planning policy says about protection of wild land. Are there ways in which the government would like to consult on changes or developments or improvements to that? And our job, obviously, is to help them in formulating how that consultation might happen.
Okay, and do you have a view on my comments regarding local authorities and their sometimes departure from the local plan?
Well, as you might expect for a non-elected NDPB, we are somewhat cautious about saying that we have a role in telling locally elected planning authorities what they should and shouldn't do. But, I mean, obviously, there is a balance between what is said in national planning policy and what is essentially for local authorities to decide in the context of that that general planning policy. So, the SPP and MP3 will obviously set out the national policy which local authorities will interpret at a local scale in their own development plans. I think, you know, as I say, a lot of the mapping work that we've done has been on the basis that the existing SPP policy about wildland character could potentially be improved, or we could be more helpful in defining that policy so it's clearer to local government what the national policy is, and therefore easier for them to interpret that at a local level.
Well, yeah, just on that, I believe in one of our briefings, I don't have it in front of me, that Highland Council have asked for greater clarity with regard to turbine applications, for example. Are you saying that that will be provided?
Well, yes, I mean, that's what we're trying to do. But obviously, we can only do that in the context of decisions that are taken about SPP and NPF3, which ministers will take. And then we can help in terms of mapping and clarifying on the ground what that might mean.
Check, Brody.
I just want to, if I may, Mr. Thinn and Mr. Jordan, come back on my question of the completion of the mapping. I know that we have here a map of the relative wildness of Scotland published last year. But then I understand that you've been examining options for identifying wildland areas which are considered to be particularly important, and that report is expected imminently. Can you help my confusion or my lack of understanding as to whether or not the mapping you say is complete? It would appear not to be complete, according to this.
The mapping that this committee asked for is complete. Ministers have also asked for mapping, a range of different mapping as part of their consideration of refreshing NPF 3 and SPP. So we've been doing that work as well. But that work, at least for the moment, pending further requests, is complete as well. But if this committee wants further mapping, we will certainly provide it.
Rather than take up the committee's time, I think it's something that we'll need further clarification on, because the advice that we have is that, yes, as I say, there is a map of relative wildness, but not the mapping of actual defined wildland areas per se is not complete.
I think that's a useful point that Chip Brodie makes. Could you perhaps write to the committee to clarify exactly what the state of play is here? That would be very useful, because I know it's quite a technical area, but there's obviously been, I think, a bit of confusion about what advice we're getting and what advice you're giving us today. So I would certainly welcome that.
We'll do that, yeah.
Can I bring in Jackson Carlow and then Maureen Watt?
Good morning. Can I ask, in essence, what the purpose of Scottish national heritage is?
We're a statutory body that provides advice to ministers and local government.
Thank you. What I really want to understand is this. Have you been nobbled?
No.
The suspicion you see is that the reason we don't have a map is because you produced a map, ministers saw it, and because it was going to interfere with plans for the development of onshore wind farms, conversations then took place that said we simply can't have this. We can't have this in the public domain. We can't possibly put statutory provision in place around all of this because it's going to interfere with our energy policy. Have any such conversations at any time taken place of that character?
There will always be suspicions about all sorts of things.
No, I'm asking, have any conversations taken place of the character I've described?
Not of the character you described, but considerable conversations have taken place with officials over a long period of time in providing them advice and providing advice in response to requests in relation to the refreshing of SPP and NPF3.
So is the reason we don't have in the public domain a map is because the government are concerned that the publication of such a map might interfere with the advancement of current energy policy?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge at all.
Is the map that finally may emerge out of all of this going to be a map which is greater than the original thoughts in terms of the map that was being designed, or will it be more restricted than the map that was originally designed?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not privy to what ministers are going to decide.
So now I'm lost. So if there is a map eventually, the map is not necessarily anything that Scottish National Heritage have ultimately themselves recommended.
Maybe I can help to clarify. The conversation that's taking place is a different one, which is about ministers' consideration about what options they wish to consult on in SPP and NPF3. For that purpose, SNH has, over the last year, produced a wide range of maps that ministers are considering in terms of informing that policy. What we don't know at this stage, obviously, is what conclusions they've drawn from that. So I'm sure they'll be weighing up lots of considerations in deciding what Scottish planning policy they're going to consult on. And for that purpose, we've produced a lot of maps that map all sorts of things for them. I don't know, and that's understandable, I think, exactly which maps they're focusing on or which ones they might include in any consultation. That I don't know.
Is the problem essentially, and I think Chick Brodie was alluding to this, that there is a contradiction here between the understanding that in some shape, size or form everybody seems to have about the advantages of looking after wild land in whatever definition one wishes to have it, and the potential for such a designation to interfere with other strategic policy objectives?
Well, I mean, I suppose that is the basis of planning policy, and what SPP is there to do is to try and strike that balance. And
Mr. Jardine, I think, said a moment ago that there were many other very significant issues other than onshore wind farm, which had to be taken into account. You mentioned upland tracks, I think, as being one, but I wondered if you could give me a schedule of some more specific, very significant issues which you think are of a parallel nature to onshore wind development, so I can judge the relative merits between these as well.
Right. Well, what I was thinking about, over time, what we've seen is a series of developments offering development opportunity in the Scottish uplands, which have proved controversial because they have an impact on the landscape and various things. And I was thinking really on a historical perspective of, we've seen the issues around historically about commercial forestry, about large-scale hydro development, about telecoms masts. So the point I was making is the policy, I don't think, should be simply about wind farms. It's a debate about how much of Scotland's upland landscape would the government wish to apply particular planning policies to, because of its nature and because of its character, which is not just about wind farms.
Thank you.
Maureen Watt.
Yes, that previous answer, Mr. Jardine, has kind of gone on to what I was wanting to ask, which is what consultation has there been with people living in or near areas that may be designated as wildland? Because I was thinking particularly, are people going to be denied broadband connection because, you know, they're not going to be allowed a telemast because, you know, in terms of broadband, you're not going to get cabling everywhere. You are in the last few areas going to have to rely on masts. So I just wondered how much consultation has there been with people who may be affected by any particular wildland designation in terms of, you know, belonging to the 21st century.
If the government proposes changes to SPP and NPF3 of any kind, there will be consultation on that. There's no proposal yet, so there is as yet no consultation, but there will be.
Your designations of wild lands and wilderness, have you consulted with peoples in the area?
No, we are not designating in any sense at all. We have simply sought to map from a purely objective scientific point of view where these qualities are found. And I do stress again, we've not sought, this concept of wild land I think is misleading. It's wildness, it's the experiential qualities. What we've sought to map are those experiential qualities.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Thin, Mr. Jardine. Just to try and clarify, Mr. Jardine, you indicated that maps have been produced for the Scottish Government for their consideration in terms of SPP and NPF3. Could you tell me whether or not those maps are publicly available, or will they be held confidential to the Government?
At the moment, those maps are, I understand, are advice to ministers that we produced beyond the simply analytical map, which is the map you see in the relative wildness map. Further maps which are, if you like, analyses of that data in a particular way, we are currently treating as advice to ministers, and no doubt ministers will decide when to publish those in the future.
So, just so I'm clear, Scottish Natural Heritage have no plans or cannot publish those maps as they currently stand?
As it stands, I would certainly seek permission from Scottish Government before I would publish those maps, yes.
Just to try and get clarification on the maps, Convener. In terms of the wildness map, and I understand the designation that Mr. Thin has actually given in terms of measuring wildness and the characters and nature of actually defining what you would actually define as wildness. You ended up in one point saying that there was actually the scenic issues regarding the individual and what the individual considered to be wildness, rather than any real designation being applied to land. If we have a category in terms of the map that Mr Jardine referred to, in terms of high wildness, then how do we ensure protection for those areas where they have been classified as high? Bearing in mind Mr Thinn's comments about no piece of land in Scotland at the present time has been unaffected by man over the centuries and over the millennium. How do we ensure that we actually protect those areas where they are rated as being of high wildness?
Current Scottish planning policy, far less anything that might change. Current Scottish planning policy attaches a high level of priority to the protection of wild land character or wildness, those qualities. And I've made the point that those are experiential. So we've sought to map them on the basis of what we think a broad consensus of those qualities would be. If current policy is applied, then developments which would have a significant impact on that quality of wildness in those areas would not be consented. But that doesn't mean to say that there are many things that happen in Scotland, including in what are being called wildland areas, which don't have a significant impact on wildness.
Just for clarification, you indicated the policy in place to protect that land, the high level of wildness, because we don't have a designation as yet of wild land. Mr MacDonald, my colleague, made reference to local authorities, particularly Highlands Council, seeking clearer guidance or guidelines, or is it potentially regulation in relation to how that any developments or proposed developments on land that is highly designated as wildness land? What would you say to those local authorities who are coming back and saying we need clearer guidance or we need regulation to ensure that we are clear about how we protect the land that is designated as high in terms of your wildness mapping?
I think what Highland Council and indeed others, including developers and including wind farm developers, are asking for is greater clarity of definition as to what is meant by the term wild land character. And that is what we've been seeking to attempt to do with ministers, is to get a tighter definition, which I think will help everybody. Clarity of policy is essential if planning is going to work in an efficient and effective manner.
I'm sure you can understand, Mr Finn, that there is concern, and the John Muir Trust petition clearly indicates a concern that if we don't have a wildland designation, then the protection of that wild land may not take place, and we may see unfettered or potentially unfettered developments taking place in areas that are seen as, in terms of the wildness mapping, seen as being high in terms of your classification. How do we ensure, and I'm just trying to compare the petition that we have before us with what SNH can do and what the Scottish Government can do to ensure and give confidence to the general population of Scotland that the SNH are carrying out their duty to protect the natural landscape.
Under current planning policy, there is no risk at all of unfettered development in what are being called wildland areas or areas of wildland character, because current planning policy already makes that very clear. So there's no question of unfettered development. The difficulty that is being addressed is that there is insufficient clarity, I think, in current planning policy to enable people to be for the system to work smoothly, efficiently, and effectively. So you have, for example, people saying, well, is this an area of wildland character or is it not? And you also have a question, will this development have a significant impact on that wildland character or not? So there's two separate issues in there, and that needs clarified. But as things stand, there's no chance at all of unfettered development in these areas.
Mr Thinn, you made a reference to earlier contribution to good developments. Could you define good developments?
I'm defining it in that context as a development that fits with planning policy.
Current planning policy, future planning policy, or what planning policy? Current planning policy or future planning policy? Because as we've heard this morning, NPF 3 is currently being worked through by the Scottish Government. The Scottish Natural Heritage have been asked to submit maps in terms of SPP. What planning policy are we working towards? And is there potentially any major changes down the road in relation to planning policy for Scotland in terms of NPF 3 that may lead to further concerns by organisations such as John Muir Trust in relation to where we're going in terms of future potential development on land in Scotland?
Planning policy continually evolves to take account of changing circumstances. So this question of what is good is continually evolving. But I think it's a reasonable definition to say that if a proposal fits with planning policy as written, one can reasonably describe that as good. The difficulty that we're dealing with here is that the planning policy in this particular area is not sufficiently clear for some people's needs.
Just for further clarification, Convener, could Mr Thinn or Mr Jardine indicate what would be the reaction of SNH if the Scottish Government or a future Scottish Government were to revoke all current planning guidance in relation to protection of land, the wild land characteristics that have been defined by SNH? And what would be the reaction of SNH in those circumstances?
Well, I think that gets back to, our job is, as was clarified in the earlier question, to advise on the protection and enhancement of natural heritage. Our advice would be that this land is an important part of Scotland's natural heritage. It's part of the image that this country portrays internally and externally. It's a key feature comparing with other parts of Western Europe. Therefore, not to protect it would have a damaging effect on Scotland's natural heritage. At the end of the day, that's all SNH can do, is advise ministers what might damage our natural heritage and what might benefit it. So we would give that advice.
Just to get on the record, Convener, could Mr Thinn or Mr Jardine indicate whether or not SNH are involved in any community planning partnerships in Scotland? Yes. And what is their role in these community planning partnerships? If you say that the SNH role is to advise the Scottish Government, then what is the role in community planning partnerships, and what has been the role, particularly in community planning partnerships where we have high designations of wildness in Scotland?
SNH is involved in quite a significant number of community planning partnerships. I'm a member of the National Group on Community Planning. We chair, in fact, at least one community planning partnership. Our role in community planning partnerships is primarily to ensure that the national public services that we deliver are delivered in a manner that's locally sensitive and integrated into other local delivery.
Thank you, Convener.
Jim Brody?
Yes, gentlemen. In the past fortnight, several Scottish newspapers have reported that maps drawn up by SNH, which we alluded to, which we're seeking clarification on, have identified around 28% of Scottish countryside as wild land. Where did they get that information?
What they've taken there is a different number. The 28% is the 2009 visibility, the N3 indicator, which the Chairman referred to earlier on, which is not the same thing. It is the number for that indicator, which is simply looking at visibility of built structures. As I say, in mapping wild land, we've looked at other things besides, or wildland character. We've mapped other things besides visibility. So the two are not the same.
I think that's very clear. We hope that you would also help the media understand that as well, because the perception it creates. Can I just one last question? SNH put out planning guidelines on wind energy I think about a year and a half ago. Do you think these have been followed? And if they haven't, my experience is they haven't, why not?
We've published a huge range of guidance on wind farms over a period now of the best part of 5 to 10 years. And we continue to do that, and we'll continue to update that as circumstances change and as planning policy changes. By and large, the guidelines have been followed by most responsible developers. Not all developers do follow our advice. If and in particular, if we advise that a proposal is likely to be contrary to national policy and the developer proceeds to go ahead, and there are a number in the pipeline at the moment like that, we will lodge a formal objection. Not something we do often, but we do occasionally, so that ministers are alerted and ministers can decide what they wish to do.
The reason I ask that is clearly whatever definition or whatever areas will be protected and accompanied with Scottish Government planning guidelines and guidelines drawn up by yourselves. I mean, there's a very little point in defining areas as wild land if planners are going to choose to develop the guidelines or even take their own guidelines regarding how that land should be developed. It comes back to Jackson Carlow's question, what is the purpose of SNH?
Well, I answered the question, I hope, at the time, but in the specific case that you mentioned, if let's say a planning application, there are I think 4, possibly 5 planning applications at the moment in the pipeline, which we consider conflict with national planning, Scottish planning policy and NPF 2 in relation to wildland character. So in those 4 or maybe 5 cases, we have lodged a formal objection so that ministers can be alerted to the fact that those applications conflict with planning policy now. Ministers then will decide what they do. We're not elected, we're not a regulator.
Thank you.
Does any other member wish to ask questions to our witnesses? Can I just ask a final question to Mr. Jardine, just to go back to the point I made earlier, and you kindly referenced the N3 indicator that I mentioned. Could I just be clear, Mr. Jardine, that since 2010 that has not been publicly available? Is my understanding correct on that or not?
I haven't updated it since the 2009 figure. That's
so
correct.
That is correct. Right.
Yes.
Has the analysis been done for 2013 for N3?
No, because it takes time to gather the information. We're always a few years behind in publishing it. We're currently updating N3 using 2010 data. So it does, just because, as you can imagine, trying to do a calculation which covers the whole of Scotland in terms of what you can see from where is a huge calculation. So it is always lagging behind. But we're currently trying to update that using the next year's data. We've had technical difficulties with that. But if we're right in confirm the situation on maps, perhaps it would be a good idea for me to give you a definitive timescale for when and what we can publish on visibility as well.
That would be useful. I mean, as you can understand, I think John Muir Trust and others are concerned that there's information that the public should know about that they don't know about. So perhaps you could just clarify, is there N3 information, for example, that you have that's not been publicly announced?
There's nothing we have that is, if you like, fit for publication, i.e. we need to make sure that when we publish it, we need to make sure it's right. And we have had technical problems with the N3. We want to make sure that when we publish the N3 stuff, it is defensible, it's right, it's technically correct. And that's been the issue.
So it's not an issue, as Jackson Carlow hinted at, that you've been under any political pressure not to release that crucial information?
No.
Okay, and perhaps you could clarify that when you write back. Thank you. The next step is for the committee to look at the next stage for the petition. Committee members will obviously have their own views. I think it's a very important petition. I think clearly we need to continue it. I think it would make sense to have the Minister Paul Wheelhouse to come before us at a future meeting and talk in detail about this. You've both given us evidence today. I think we need to have the politicians involved as well in this issue. So I would certainly recommend, as a minimum, we do that, but obviously it's a matter for the committee as a whole. Could they then throw it open to committee members for their views on the next step? Are members agreeable with that course? Jackson Carroll.
I very much agree with the suggestion you're making. I found this morning's session like chasing a bar of soap in a bath, frankly. And I really think we need to have the Minister present.
Okay, thank you for that. Could I have views from other members? Are members agreeable with that course of action? Thank you. So we are going to continue this petition, and we are going to ask the Minister Paul Wheelhouse to attend a future meeting. Could I thank both of our witnesses for coming along today? This is obviously a very technical area, but thank you for the information and advice that you've given us. And I'll suspend the meeting for 1 minute to allow our 2 witnesses to leave and our new witness to join. So thanks very much, gentlemen, for coming along today. Now restart our meeting. We're on agenda item 4, considerations of new petitions. There are 2 new petitions for consideration today. As previously agreed, the committee will evidence on one of these new petitions. So the first is PE 1469 by Aileen Jackson on neighbourhood notification distances for wind turbine applications. Members have a note by the clerk, the spice briefing, the petition and a submission from Scotland Against Spin. Can I welcome the petitioner, Aileen Jackson, and Graham Lang, the chairman of Scotland Against Spin, to the meeting, and can invite Aileen Jackson to make a short presentation of no more than 5 minutes, and after that I'll ask a few questions and then throw open to my colleagues. Aileen Jackson.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting us both here today. My name's Aileen Jackson, and I've lived with my family in a farmhouse near the village of Uplandmoor in East Renfrewshire for the last 29 years. Until 3 years ago, we had no reason to have any involvement in planning applications. Then a telephone call from a friend in the village changed everything. Our immediate neighbours, farmers and good friends for 26 years, whom we spoke to on a daily basis, had submitted a planning application for 3 wind turbines only 280 metres from the south of our house. They had never mentioned it to us. Upon checking the online planning applications list, we also stumbled across a 5-month-old application for a neighbouring community's wind farm only 1 kilometre to the east. 4 turbines, 120 metres in height, which by the developer's own admission would have a significant effect on our property, yet about which we had not been informed. On the same planning list, we also discovered an application for 2 more turbines, 500 metres to the north. 9 turbines in total surrounding our home, which could all have been approved without our knowledge. We are astonished to discover local authorities have no statutory obligation to notify residents of a development as life-changing as wind turbines, unless the application site was closer than 20 metres from a neighbour's boundary. We were informed other means of notification existed, but like the majority of rural residents, we only occasionally bought our local newspaper, never thought of checking the back pages for planning applications, had no reason to visit our local library, and never scrutinised the Council's weekly online planning list. But we do now. One of the most common complaints made in representations submitted to planning departments is no one told us. We only found out by accident. Unfortunately, by the time they do find out by accident, the deadline has passed and it's too late for their representations to be considered. A wind farm or even a single turbine development cannot be compared with a house extension. the erection of a garden wall, or even a telecommunications monopole. Turbines are big, can be monstrous. Unlike pylons, they rotate, sound louder at night than during the day, and no one wants to live close to them. Turbines situated near businesses such as those in the leisure and tourist industry can have a devastating effect, and smaller scale developments, which are often sited even closer to properties, are not subject to the same level of assessment by the planning authority as their larger counterparts, thus requiring in-depth local knowledge to scrutinise the often misleading information submitted by the applicant. Having consulted planners from East Renfrewshire Council and Planning Aid, everyone seemed to agree the current 20-metre neighbour notification distance for wind turbines was in need of revision, but the potential increased cost to local authorities must be a major consideration in any proposed change in legislation. As outlined in my petition, I would like to suggest that any residential or other property within a distance of 10 times the overall height of the turbine from the proposed development site must receive notification of the planning application, whether it is for a single or multiple turbine development. This modest change would not financially burden the local authority should they be reluctant to pass on the increase in administration costs to the applicant. It would notify those most affected who would hopefully spread the word to others. I would suggest that all other means of notification must still be used: newspaper advertisement, council website and library exposure, as it must be borne in mind that in some cases there may still be few, if any, properties within the notification distance, and owners of some of those properties may be friends or family of the applicant. For that reason, I would also like the committee to consider that should there still be less than 10 properties directly notified under this proposal, the 10 nearest properties to any turbine development of any scale not in the ownership of the applicant should receive neighbour notification. This would also deter developers submitting applications for sites just outside the notification distance in order to avoid detection. And yes, it does happen. You have no idea how wily they can be. Depending on the local authority, between 6 and 10 objections are required for a local development to be considered by the Planning Applications Committee, as opposed to a decision being made under delegated powers. As the planning process benefits from public engagement, allowing officials to prepare accurate reports and councillors to make informed decisions, it seems reasonable that at least 10 properties be directly notified to facilitate responses, and should there be objections, be given a hearing by the Planning Applications Committee. All of this is very much in the spirit of the 2006 Act, a reforming measure which you passed in this Parliament. Under current planning legislation, too many people are being denied the right to become involved in the planning process with a type of development which could have a major impact on their lives for many years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for talking to your petition. I have a couple of points, just first of all to summarise my understanding. Effectively what you're doing then is want to extend more democracy into the system of approval or otherwise of wind turbines. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Right. And you mentioned just at the end about evidence. Clearly I understand the position in your own area, but do you see this as a problem throughout Scotland?
Yes, we've looked at applications throughout the whole of Scotland, and it seems to be the same no matter which area you live in.
And you also looked at what other European countries do as far as approval process is concerned. Have you done any research into that?
Yes. Well, we tried to find as much as we could in Europe, and there's practically nothing on the internet we can find in Europe. So we had a look at England and Wales. Wales seem to just defer to Scotland. They seem to refer everyone to look at our legislation. England, depending on which county you live in, they're all different. It's a bit woolly. Apparently their neighbour notification consists of who is directly affected by the application, what the potential impacts are of the application, the type of application and the scale of application, and it's up to the planning officer, depending where you live, to make that decision. So we need something more concrete in Scotland, I think, rather than something as vague as they have in England.
So it's difficult then to point any best practice throughout Europe, because obviously, first of all, because Scotland tends to have the bulk of the areas that are really good for wind turbines, but there's not really good practice you could point out in other parts of UK or in Europe?
No, there's absolutely no good practice anywhere, and I think certainly the 10 nearest properties being notified is about the simplest idea we could come up with and the fairest.
Yes. Thank you for that. Mr Lang.
I think Scotland sets a very high benchmark in its policy and the way it considers these matters. I think what we're looking at is, well, first of all, I've looked at a number of applications in different locations, and my initial submission illustrated 1 in Fife, and I've made a supplementary submission, which I don't know whether it's been made available or not, but I hope it will be available to you after the meeting, concerning another application at Lunan Head in Angus. And I think really what we've got here is sort of unintended consequences. I think the policy or the guidance has been designed in a way that has not considered wind farms or wind turbines. It considers dwellings, houses, and as Aileen said, garden walls and other small developments where neighbours would be caught up in the present 20-yard criteria. But if you look at some stage at the supplementary evidence that I've given, you actually find that properties nearer to the turbine are not given notification, whereas properties nearer to the track or the 20 metres from the track are given neighbour notification. So it really doesn't make sense. We want something that's manageable, affordable and sensible.
So just so I'm clear, the costs of this, the additional notification, will be met by the individuals who's making the application. Is that correct? In your
well, there's always that possibility. They meet the cost of the advertisement when the application is made. So it used to be, of course, that individuals making a planning application did the neighbour notification, but legislation, I think that was changed in 2009, August 3rd, 2009, changed that to make it the responsibility of the competent authority. But there's something falling between two posts here. There's people that have an interest are being excluded, and this is where the democratic question comes in.
And I suppose the other, just looking at the devil's advocate approach here, do you think then this will cause delays in decision making on wind farms if there's an increase in the amount of individuals who are going to be consulted before it can go ahead?
See why there should be. At the moment, they obviously have to inform neighbours that are very close, but there are very few neighbours in a rural environment that are going to be closer than 20 metres. If they don't, they still have to put an advertisement in the local newspaper. So there is still some sort of neighbour notification available. It's not going to take very long for someone in a planning department, an administration officer, to sit and work out how many people are going to be within, say, what we've proposed here. I mean, it's possibly only going to be 10 properties. It's not going to cost very much. It's not going to take very long to work out.
Thank you for that. I'll pass over to Chip Brodie.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms Jackson, Mr Lang. It's true, Ms Jackson, we actually do have guidelines. What you're questioning is how acceptable is the 20-metre threshold, and I have some sympathy with that. Let me ask, firstly, in terms of the community, I mean, you've gone through all these, you know, not everybody has a computer, not everybody has. In your experience, is there such a thing as in the areas that you're in, a community where there is a community council, or where information is shared on the basis of community, or you know, how do things like this, are they communicated mouth to mouth?
Well, I'll give you an example of a wind farm, the one I spoke about in my statement, which is 1 kilometre from my house. It was 4 120-metre turbines, and our community knew nothing about it because the local authority failed in their statutory duty to inform our community council. And it was only by accident I stumbled across it while looking at the planning applications list. No one out of the 500 people who live in our village knew about that application. Well, when I discovered the application, we got a group together and we leafleted the village ourselves.
action did you take against the council if it did not meet its statutory obligation?
We couldn't take any action against them. We pointed it out to them and they apologised, and that was all we got from them. And the application was actually consented, and it could possibly have been consented without anyone in Uplamore actually knowing about it or being able to object to it if it wasn't for the fact I had fallen across the application.
Right. I mean, it is quite appropriate this comes after the last session, but there are guidelines that say wind farms, and it depends on the scale of the wind farm, or with a single wind turbine or 20 wind turbines, and clearly that has to be a factor. But the guidelines are that there should be no erection of wind turbine within 2 kilometres of the nearest households. Have you had that discussion with the local council, or did you have that with regard to the particular application you're referring to?
What, the 2 kilometre setback guideline? That is very rarely adhered to. If they can meet the noise requirements on a wind farm, then they'll put them as close to you as they can get them. Yes.
The Scottish planning policy does mention a setback of 2,000 metres from a turbine, but everything has to be judged on its own merits in planning terms. And if the developer can establish that there are no significant adverse effects in terms of noise or shadow flicker on somebody who's maybe 800 metres away, then that means that the 2,000 metre setback has been addressed. They've shown that they can produce a proposal that is sufficiently robust that the 2,000 metre setback doesn't really apply. And I would just like to say something about the community councils you were mentioning. And obviously, to my knowledge, most community councils get a weekly update from the local planning authority of what applications are in the planning authority area, which obviously includes the community council area. And they do, I imagine, look at these documents, but it doesn't necessarily generate a wider distribution of the knowledge. Unless you happen to go to a community council meeting, then you're unlikely to be made aware of anything that was discussed at it, or you read the minutes. So it's not a sort of catch-all situation.
I take that point, and that sort of underpins the fact that community councils are not perhaps as robust as they might be. Just one last question, if I may, convener. How closely do the developers work with the community in terms of pre-planning and pre-scoping, or pre-scoping and then pre-planning? I mean, do you think, particularly Mr. Lang, because I know your experience, are developers taking an interest in the impact it has on communities? I suspect it's varied, but I'd like your views.
Obviously, the developers like to work closely with the communities if they can, and one of the, or perhaps the very first thing they do before bringing a proposal through as a planning application is that they meet with community groups, whether it's the community council or other interested focus groups in the area, to outline their proposal, but more importantly, to outline their community benefit. And this is a sort of, I call a softening up approach, and it's standard practice. So the first thing people know about a wind farm coming to the area, and we're not just talking about wind farms here, is when the developer makes an announcement and encourages people to come to a forum to discuss what they could all do with the community benefit should they get planning permission.
That's Carlo.
Thank you, Convener, and I should just say that the petitioner is known to me. Of course, it's ironic with all this high wind blowing about that we're discussing this, because probably the dashed things will all be switched off because they don't work when there's high winds. But this is really not a petition about the benefits or otherwise of wind farms. It's about neighbour notification. 120 metres, what's that in old money?
Feet, you mean?
Yeah.
It's about 360 feet.
360 feet. 360 feet. Can you think of anything that's 360 feet that we could typically visualise?
What size is Big Ben?
Big Ben. So this is really like Big Ben being stuck up 20 metres. That's maybe as wide as this room is just now. So without any notification to neighbours, something as large as Big Ben under the current legislation could be erected 20 metres from where the people at the back of the room are standing from their property boundary, essentially, without them having to be notified.
That's exactly it.
And I think that really is the essence of the petition that you're bringing about here. I can't think of any garden wall, Mr. Lang, that's been built at 120 metres in height. It would be a very exceptional garden wall. I mean, even the Berlin Wall, I don't think quite ran to 120 metres in height. I can't think of a tree that grows to 120 metres in Scotland. I mean, we're being invited to consider a national tree, but I can't think of one that runs to 120 metres, convener. So the picture I have here is that your concern, irrespective of the merits of the debate about wind farm technology, and that is not really the essence of this petition, it's that when in 2006 and subsequently thereafter neighbour notification issues have been discussed, this 20-metre threshold has really not, it would appear, featured in any legislative consideration. And that your point is that given the height of these things in relation to a property, 20 metres falls way short of what would reasonably be acceptable for someone to have proper notification of. That's the essence of this.
Yes, I think 20 metres is perfectly acceptable in an urban environment. I mean, you're going to get conservatories and walls and things. 20 metres is fine, and 20 metres notification in a town or a city is going to catch quite a few neighbours who can pass the information on to others. But in a rural environment, there's very rarely anybody within 20 metres of your house.
And you're proposing some sort of formula, are you, in relation to the notification requirement?
Well, yes, we felt if it was 10 times the tip height of the turbine, the overall height, certainly with the bigger wind farms, that would catch quite a number of people. I mean, for example, the one near our house would have taken in 14 properties. 14 properties, including myself, would have been notified if you use this. But with the smaller turbines, maybe 20, 30, 40 metre turbines, you're still maybe going to get very few people, if any, notified. So we felt it fairest that the 10 nearest properties should also always be notified, no matter what the overall height of the turbine.
And this really is, in essence, because people in the community currently feel slightly cheated by the system, which I don't think it was designed to do, because the terms of neighbour notification were probably established before wind turbines were a major consideration in relation to development. And that what you're proposing would ensure that those people who any reasonable person would probably think ought to be notified would now be notified. That's the essence of this.
That's the essence of it, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I think here we need to make a distinction between wind farms and turbines that individual farmers are putting up for their own use on their farmland. Because if you're talking about wind farms from developers, then as you said yourself, they would engage with the community with a public evening or whatever, and set out maps and things as to where the turbines are going to be. So here we're talking about individual farms putting up 1, 2, 3 turbines for, in essence, mostly their own use. Okay, on you go.
No, I was going to say not necessarily. I mean, although, yes, most developers do have public days and they do inform the local community, as it so happened, ours didn't, because the wind farm in Uplamure is actually a wind farm for the Neilston community, and it was advertised by the developers as Neilston Community Wind Farm. So even although there were leaflets left lying about in Neilston, people from Uplamure who happened to pass through never took any notice of them because it didn't have Uplamure on the leaflet. So we thought, why should we bother? Why should we complain about a wind farm for Neilston when we live in Uplamure? And it wasn't until I discovered the application and looked at the environmental statement that we realised that Neilston Community Wind Farm was in Uplamore, not in Neilston, and we were never consulted by the developers.
So you're not talking about that development here in your petition, are you?
That's the one I'm talking about that was a kilometre from my house, yes. And it is, it's a community wind farm. It's owned by developers and by the community. So it's slightly different from most. But yes, I'm talking about single turbines as well, owned by farmers. Yes, I still think that the 10 nearest properties to single turbines should always be notified.
If that same farmer was to put up 3 or 4 chicken sheds, which would be a hell of a lot noisier than a wind turbine, would you get neighbour notification on that?
No, because it would be an agricultural development and they don't need to notify anyone. They have development rights, so we wouldn't be notified of that. But a chicken shed is still not the height of a turbine and it still doesn't rotate. And chickens tend to go to sleep at night. The lights go out and they go quiet. Turbines get noisier at night.
Daughter sometimes not. Okay, thank you.
With that, does any other member wish to ask a question or point? Taggart?
Yeah, really. Just to follow on from what Jackson Carlaw was saying, I mean, it's a no-brainer. I'm not really sure why we would want... I don't think it's unreasonable what the petitioner is asking here for 10 times the nearest properties. I would, though, like to seek further clarification and views from the Scottish Government with regards to that, but so far I've not... I just think it's a no-brainer.
Yeah. No, Mr. Lang.
Yes, I think it's important to draw a distinction between wind farms and the feed-in tariff-inspired farmer applications, and all applications on farmland are not by the farmer. Many of them are by speculative developers who will pay a rent to the farmer and take most of the income for themselves. So while the farmer will receive a benefit, it's not always entirely his development. I think that the most important thing here today is to drill down to what is the essential unfairness of this. And that is that the policy, as I said on page 3 of my submission, it made quite clear that in the case of farms, estates where a building is being erected on one part of the farm and so on and so forth, they talk about buildings, they don't talk about wind turbines. Wind turbines were in the frame at that time, but mostly wind farms, and they would be given a lot of publicity and information. What we're talking about here really is the smaller developments where a farmer can apply for a wind turbine 200 metres, 280 metres from somebody's house without them being given notification. If, as the petitioner has suggested, I would really prefer to forget about the 10 times tip height and say that all 10 properties, the 10 nearest properties to any wind turbine development, the property owner should be informed. And it's quite simple.
Anne Taggart?
Really, also, convener, could I add to what I had said? Whilst listening to Ms Jackson, there was nothing that you could do about the council. Could we possibly, as a committee, also ask the Scottish Government about sanctions when these rules are not adhered to? Because it sounds wholly inappropriate and totally unfair once you do get to that situation and that there is no...
Yeah. That's a good point. Thank you for that. Angus MacDonald.
Yes, thanks, Convener. I actually do have a great deal of sympathy with this petition and perhaps should declare an interest in that a current live application from a public utility company to build 10 turbines on land sandwiched between 2 of my family's farms did not attract any notification from the local authority, and the first that was known about it by my family was when it appeared in the local newspaper. I was going to touch on community councils, however, that's been well covered. But can I ask both Eileen and Graham what advice you got from Planning Aid regarding your suggestion of notifying the 10 nearest properties? Were they supportive of this, or did they advise otherwise?
Yes, they were supportive of it. Their main concern would be the cost to the local authority, and that was why it was suggested that maybe we should tone it down slightly, because we would have liked more neighbours to be notified. But we have to take into consideration that it could be the local authority that has to cover the costs and the time and the extra administration. So we felt that this was quite reasonable, that at least some people would be informed in the hope that it would be passed on to others.
It's just the issue about neighbour notification. I declare an interest. The first I knew the farmer that bordered my garden was putting up a wind turbine is when they started working on it and erected it over a weekend. And it visually impacts on me every day because I look out my kitchen window and it sits on high on a hill overlooking the property. So I've concerns about the 10 neighbours notification issue and whether or not the 10 neighbour notification would actually be the 10 neighbours who would be most directly impacted upon by any turbine that was erected, single or wind farm that was erected. So there is an issue there. Just to hone down in terms of the cost, they said that you've suggested 10 neighbours be notified. Do you have any idea what cost that would be, either to a local authority or a developer, by issuing 10 notices to neighbours in the vicinity of a proposed wind turbine or wind farm?
Well, you mentioned something first about your own experience, and also that you suggested that it might be the 10 neighbours who are most impacted. Topography has quite an impact on the visibility and the impact of a turbine, and in my own experience it would be fairer to advise not to assess what they think the impact is, but to just see who are the nearest neighbours and contact them or advise them. I can't remember the second part.
The second part was the estimated cost of issuing 10 notices.
Yes, I don't want to make any predictions, and I would prefer to ask the local authority for a cost estimate on that. I don't know what the figures would be, but I don't think they're unaffordable in view of the experience people have had here, both on this side of the table and on that side of the table. I think it's important that as I said, unforeseen consequences. They didn't think about the proliferation of small wind farmers feed-in tariff-inspired projects when they passed this bit of legislation into action in 2009.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay. We're a bit short on time. Unless any members have got very urgent points, I would suggest that we move on. Clues, I think this is a very interesting petition. I think it's very, very thoughtful. I think certainly we need to continue it and ask the Scottish Government for their view. But as always, I always consult the committee about whether there's any additional points or whether members agree with that point of view. William Watt?
I think we should ask COSLA is a local authority issue.
As well as Scottish Government. Right. Other views from members?
No, I agree with that.
Are members agreeable then that we continue this petition and we seek the advice of the Scottish Government and COSLA on the merits of the petition? Right, thank you for that. Can I thank both our witnesses, Aileen Jackson and Graham Lang, for coming along today. It's been very helpful, your evidence that you've given us, and as you can see, we've taken a big interest in your petition, and we'll keep you up to date with developments once we get responses from COSLA and the Scottish Government. And I'll suspend for 1 minute to allow our witnesses to leave. Thank you. Our committee, the second new petition is PE 1468 by Mike Daly on behalf of the Govan Law Centre Trust on evictions due to under-occupation deductions. Members for a note by the clerk despite briefing on the petition. And could I welcome Jackie Bailey MSP to the meeting, who is an interest petition. And Jackie Bailey, could you speak to the petition?
Thank you very much, Convener, and can I thank the committee for the time afforded to me. I will be brief. Our positions on, I think, the bedroom tax are well rehearsed, and the majority of the Parliament are certainly opposed to it. And I think this petition has to be seen in that context. I think many of us, when elected to Parliament, stood for different reasons, but actually we're all here to exercise power. And the truth for me is that if we are opposed to a particular tax, or policy initiative, then if it is within our gift to do something about it, then we should be exercising those powers, not simply turning around at every opportunity and blaming Westminster for that particular policy. This petition invites us to do so in a particular way, and it looks at legislative protection for those falling into arrears as a consequence of the under-occupation element of the bedroom tax. And I think members would recognise that seeking to make anybody homeless carries a huge public cost to the public purse, but also to those individuals as well. I think the figure quoted was something like £24,000 to rehouse a homeless family. So it clearly doesn't suit the public purse to go down that route. What I think this petition delivers is a consistent approach across Scotland, not just across local authorities, but including registered social landlords as well. And indeed, there are many local authorities in Scotland having transferred their stock that actually don't have any housing stock themselves. So the imperative to do it across different sectors is clearly important. But I think some of us have been making the argument that it should be accompanied by financial assistance, and there are various estimates as to what that would be. But wherever people lie in this, I do think there is something to consider here, and to do so with a degree of urgency. Whether it's this committee or I note from the public papers, the suggestion is that it should be moved on to the Welfare Reform Committee as being more appropriate. I would certainly be supportive of that, and I hope the committee will do so and do so quickly. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. I thank Jackie Bailey again for coming along and speaking to a petition. As Jackie Bailey has said, I've been approached by Michael Mann, who's the convener of the Welfare Reform Committee, and has asked that we transfer the consideration of the petition to his committee, which obviously, as Jackie Bailey says, seems to make a lot of sense in that that's their remit. But that's a suggestion from another committee. But as always, can I throw open, because I know members have all taken a great interest in this very important petition, and can start by Chick Brodie.
Yes, thank you, and good morning, Ms Bailey. I think we all, by and large, maybe not all, sympathise with the situation that we are faced with. I think some decisions have been taken by certain other local authorities, with regard to a non-eviction policy. The consequence of this, and I have to ask, I think, a question in terms of the petitioner and the trust as to whether or not there is a conflict of interest in terms of the actions that might be pursued, and that's something I would like clarified. I don't have the answer, but I'd like it clarified. That the consequence of this is, while it addresses and would rightly address some of the issues that those that are directly affected, it might mitigate some of these issues. It then imposes a burden elsewhere on the public purse. Clearly, we don't want evictions and should be fought everywhere we can. But I wonder if Ms Bailey could give us some guidance as to what she thinks the implications would be if we pursue this particular element of policy on the rest of the public purse.
I think what's been clear and what has been argued across the piece is that this would have an impact on repairs budgets, maintenance budgets of both housing associations and local authorities. That is the case whether you have this particular petition before you or not. as arrears are more likely to arise, not least because the government have taken a view, the UK government that is, that individual tenants should have their housing benefit paid to them directly rather than to the landlord. And there are genuine fears about arrears accumulating as a consequence of that. Leaving that to one side, I think local authorities, by and large, irrespective of their political complexion, have tried very hard to make sure there is sufficient in the housing revenue budget for repairs and maintenance, and I know some have added to it as a consequence. Others have looked at the discretionary housing payments provided by the UK government and topped it up by the maximum of 1.5 extra. There is a real argument that that is insufficient based on anecdotal information about current demand, and that's something the Welfare Reform Committee may want to look at as to what actual demand for discretionary housing payments is at. But, you know, I turn to local authorities who recognise themselves that the cost of evicting somebody actually ends up being borne by the public purse. And I gave you the figures for a family. Rehousing a homeless family at £24,000 is going to cost the public purse far more. Now, I think, you know, without a shadow of a doubt, you know, this is not, and if you speak to the petitioner, very clear, not a campaign about non-payment, because they recognise the responsibilities that local authorities and housing associations have. And if we're frank, you know, there are people today still in debt as a consequence of arrears of poll tax. That is not the purpose of this petition. The purpose of this petition is to afford, in very limited circumstances, protection on a consistent basis across Scotland. And I think that's something, hopefully, we would all aspire to. But I think the suggestion of moving it on to the Welfare Reform Committee is probably the most appropriate place for that.
I understand you might want that to happen, but there's some other information I certainly would like before we talk about passing it on. And I don't think we've got all of that from the petition. And one question, of course, we talked about local authorities, then housing associations and the position that they're taking with regard to this, and of course the point that you rightly made. And we had the chair of, at the cross-party group on social enterprise, we had the chair of the Welfare Reform Committee at our last meeting indicating that, as you rightly say, the money being paid directly to, in the one particular case he highlighted, of £800 a fortnight being paid to a tenant who said, there's no point in giving me that because I will drink it before the next lot comes round. So I understand the aspirations and certainly the emotional compassion that we share regarding this particular issue. However, we've got to look at tenants as a whole, and I think there's a lot more questions that we have to ask of the petitioner before we start passing this down to the Welfare Reform Committee.
Just before we open this up, first of all, just to remind everyone that obviously Jackie Bailey is not the petitioner, so I'm obviously not going to encourage Jackie to be answering on behalf of someone. And we also agreed not to invite Mike Daly here. So in one sense, if we have questions, maybe the way to do that was to invite him, and then we could have determined that. The first point I would suggest to the committee is we really have to make a decision. Do we want to continue and have a debate about this petition, which is perfectly proper, in which case we have to make a decision about that, or do we refer it to the Welfare Reform Committee as another convener has requested? So I think the first step is we make a decision whether we either refer it, and that's perfectly appropriate. If we don't, then of course it's open to have a full debate on this. I just think we need to get that right first. Jackson Carlow?
I think, convener, it would be unusual for us to refer it without taking any further information in the first instance. This is a theoretical provision that the petition identifies, but insofar as it is potentially a reality, it is one of concern. I don't think any member of the committee would wish to see anybody suffering from an eviction. But nonetheless, as a result of Section 69 of the Welfare Reform Act 2012 and the Housing Benefit Amendment Regulations 2012, as opposed to the so-called bedroom tax, but nonetheless, I think the first and most appropriate course of action for this committee would be to follow our normal practice, and that would be to seek the views of the Scottish Government on the implications of the petition and the issues that it raises. I would recommend from COSLA, and I think also from the DWP as a matter of interest, because I would like to have some parallel suggestion as to what estimates have been made by them of the likelihood of evictions occurring in Scotland or anywhere else within the United Kingdom as a result of the provisions of the Act.
I mean, Jackson Carroll is perfectly correct. Our normal practice is that we tend to do a bit of homework before deciding to move on. The only thing it's probably unusual to get an early request to transfer. I merely did my duty by making sure everyone was aware of that point. John Bossell.
Mayor, thank you. I'd be very surprised if the Welfare Reform Committee hadn't already discussed the implications of the introduction of this piece of legislation by the UK Government. Like other members, I'd be keen to seek further information before we pass this to any committee or whatever committee we decide, if we decide to pass it on to a committee. I think there are issues quite clearly being raised by Jackie Bailey, and I think the very emotive issue of the £24,000 cost to deal with a family eviction is very emotive and clearly is worrying when you use those types of figures for local authorities, and that's presupposing that local authorities will move to evict someone who falls into arrears because of this particular piece of legislation. It will be up to local authorities to make the decisions on a case-by-case basis. However, I have other concerns in relation to wider concerns about the changes that are coming through from Westminster in terms of benefit welfare reform legislation. And this is just one of a number of changes the UK Government have actually proposed in terms of welfare reform. And it's whether or not the Scottish Government or local authorities should be asked to pay for welfare reform changes that are being proposed by Westminster, and how much these local authorities and the Scottish Government can afford to offset the impact of welfare reform policies from Westminster. And members have got to ask themselves whether or not it is the duty of the Scottish Government or local authorities to continue to pay for proposals that come out of Westminster that impact most severely on those on the lowest incomes. And we have other benefit changes that are about to come forward in terms of the cut in the maximum level of benefit that will be payable to a family. And while the Scottish Government and local authorities, I know in Scotland, have attempted to try and offset the worst impacts of some of these changes, the difficulty is the Scottish Government budget and local authority budgets are restricted. And if we continue to use those budgets that is currently set to offset the benefit changes that are coming out of Westminster, then I think we're denying the inevitable that we may be asked as a Scottish Government, or be asking the Scottish Government and local authorities to continue to pay for changes that are coming out of Westminster. And we must find the best method possible to protect the people of Scotland against these benefit changes. And I don't think it's always a remedy just to step in and ask either the Scottish Government or local authorities to bear the brunt of those costs. Convener, there has been a suggestion we write to the Scottish Government, COSLA and others. Could I suggest we also write to SFHA, because the point has been made this morning that many of the organisations throughout Scotland that provide social housing will be the housing associations and housing cooperatives. And I think it would be only but right to write to those organisations to ask them what the impact of this piece of legislation, along with other pieces of legislation that have come out of Westminster in terms of caps, in terms of the housing benefit caps, to find out, because there are serious concerns about the ongoing financial viability for housing associations if these changes keep on taking place in terms of benefits being paid, because some housing associations operate in the most vulnerable communities we have in Scotland, and the impact on those housing associations may be most severe. But there is another issue in terms of the under-occupation, sorry about this, Convener, about the under-occupation issue, and that is about the availability of alternative housing. And I find it, and I have said this previously, somewhat mystifying that the same political party that introduced the right to buy is the same political party that has introduced the under-occupation the benefit cut that is currently being faced by many or potentially benefit claimants at the present time. So there are no issues, and those of us who were around just over 30 years ago dealing with the right to buy issue could have foresaw a situation where a subsequent Conservative government would actually penalise people for living in social housing.
Thank you. Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Convener. My remarks are because of my convenership of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee, and we had an inquiry into how the homelessness legislation was working 10 years on. And evictions are not the main cause of homelessness, and it says in the petition here, Govan Law Centre defends a high volume eviction actions in Glasgow. Well, maybe it does. That was not my experience of when we took evidence in Glasgow. But eviction is the last resort for all housing providers that we interviewed and saw and took evidence from. So I'm not sure whether that sentence in the petition is true or not. As I say, it wasn't the experience of our committee. So, you know, I think it's important, as John said, that we get the views of the SFHA, because certainly in other parts of the country, eviction was the totally, utterly ultimate action. So I'm not sure that what is put in the petition is in fact correct, and I don't think we should immediately go further without taking further evidence.
Thank you for that. So there's been a suggestion then that rather than referred on to the committee at this stage, we follow normal practice and seek advice from Scottish Government, COSLA, DWP and the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. I think a number of members have suggested that. Could I just confirm that is the majority view of the committee? Yep. That we take this forward? And Anne McTaggart?
Can I also just let it be noted, Convener, that we have looked at we didn't ask for Mike Daly to be present here today as a committee. We have also noted that some of the emotional concerns that have been risen today. But could I also just ask, I mean, is housing a matter for the Scottish Government? And it is about a housing matter.
No,
why would we not move on to the Welfare Committee when it's about welfare reform, and also the Welfare Committee are dealing with this at the moment? I'm just thinking about the duplication of work.
Well, it's right to say that the Welfare Reform Committee has discussed this, but I think just in terms of the sort of history of the committee, certainly my experience is that the normal practice is before we refer on, we normally do a bit more digging and investigation, you know, on our own, and that's a fair comment in terms of the custom and practice that we followed. Sure. Well, I would certainly hope that we were able to pursue. Sorry, Jackie Bailey.
Could I perhaps make a helpful suggestion? Because if this committee is going to investigate it further, then that's what this committee does. But it struck me that from Chick Brodie and I think somebody else as well, from Maureen Watt, there were questions that only the petitioner could clarify. And I wonder whether it would be appropriate when it next is considered by the committee to have the petitioner here to provide that clarity, because I do take the point about, time is marching on, and that would be a perhaps helpful way of dealing with it.
I think that's a reasonable point. I do, however, raise the issue of the conflict of interest, because, as is pointed out, Govan Law Centre defends a high volume of eviction actions in Glasgow and specialises in the prevention. Now, I know that Ms Bailey screws up her nose at that, but that is quite an important issue as to the promotion of this petition when there is potential. I'm not saying there is, but there's a potential beneficence from the action that's taken. So I would seek clarification on that. I'm not saying that the petitioners shouldn't be here, but I think I do seek clarification.
Yeah,
I understand.
Just, I'm very conscious we could spend the next couple of hours. I'll bring in Jackson Carl in a second. Can I just concentrate on what we obviously are agreeing on, which is that we are continuing this petition to seek advice from the 4 groups that I mentioned earlier. So can we just confirm that before we open this up? Because I'm very conscious we could have a 2-hour debate on a couple of points of law, which we're not here to do. First of all, are we agreeable that we're going to do that course of action? Right, that's the second point. The second point is there's been, I think, a helpful suggestion about having Mike Daly along. Now, although, as you know, the committee didn't feel that was a point they wanted to do last time, it's the old cliche that as the facts change, so do your opinions. If the committee would find that useful, I certainly would have no objection to that, but I want to sound out all the committee members on that. Jackson Carlo?
I'm always very grateful for noises off stage contributing to our consideration of the actions we might take. But I would have thought the purpose of writing in the first instance is to inform us further as to what we would then do. And I think to invite anybody along in anticipation of what we might do on the receipt of the information we've now requested would be premature.
And if there's any points of information at this stage you want from the petitioner, certainly the clerk can write to Mike Daly about that at this stage. John Wilson?
Convener, I agree that we hold off inviting the petitioner until we have some information back from the 4 organisations we've agreed to write to. I would like to add, sorry about this, Convener, add a fifth, and that is we write to the Welfare Reform Committee, the clerks or the convener, and ask them if they have considered this change and what is their timetable if they have not considered it for the consideration. And while Anne McTaggart's quite right that the Scottish Government has responsibility for housing, it does not have responsibility for housing benefit. It's the Westminster Government that has still control over the benefit system that the people of Scotland rely on to survive. And it's really the wider question is whether or not we can continue to allow changes at Westminster level to impact so severely on the people of Scotland.
Our members agreeable we contact Welfare Reform. They have discussed it, as I said, but I think we should get a detailed timetable from them so that we avoid any duplication. Are members agreeable to that course of action? Can I thank you for that? I know this was a difficult area, but thank members for keeping in about this particular issue. And can I finally thank Jackie Bailey again for coming along. Jackie Bailey is an honourable member of this committee for her contributions. Thank you. Thank you for that. Can I move on to agenda item 5, consideration of current petitions. The next item is PE 1395 by Jan Kulak on target funding for lesser taught languages and cultures at universities, member of a note by the clerk, and the submissions. And before I invite contributions from members, I think we have Hugh McMahon in the audience who's been a strong supporter of this petition. I think this has been a very interesting petition. So it's very much about how do you assess demand for courses that are no longer running. And we've had, as you know, a number of continued comments where we were in touch with the Scottish Funding Council and universities generally. I think there has been a further paper prepared which by the Higher Education Academy, and the author is John Dunn, a retired Scottish academic. I think there may still be some merit in this in asking Mike Russell or one of his colleagues to come and have a final contribution of evidence to us. I know members may feel, because I see Jackson Carlo's face here, may feel that we have spent too long with this individual petition. However, I do feel it's a very valuable one because the point well made, I think, if you take, for example, the amount of Poles that are working in Scotland, I think the quote was, I don't have evidence for this figure, but I think there's most people speak Polish than Gaelic, for example. It's very, very important developments, and I do think it's important we get a minister along to give us some final comments about this before we conclude this petition. But as always, I will throw this open for committee members, and I'll start with Jackson Carlo.
I mean, I won't object if that's what members, colleagues believe, but my own view is that we've actually brought together quite a body of evidence now, and that there would be merit in referring it on to the Education Committee, who might actually want to raise these issues with the Minister directly and with their broader experience of the subject matter in hand.
Thank you for that. Anne McTaggart.
Thanks, Convener. Really just reiterating the concerns that you had raised earlier about the Polish community, and not having the exact figure, but I think it's important. I would much prefer to have the Education Minister along here to answer to it. And I'm aware that we have collated now, and it has been going on a long time, but I think it's such an important issue and I wouldn't want it to be lost. Therefore, I would be asking for the Education Convener, or Minister, sorry, to to speak to it.
Thank you. Other members? Angus MacDonald?
My initial reaction is to refer the matter to the Education and Culture Committee. However, if the majority of the members are content to have the Minister or the Cabinet Secretary here, then fair enough. But I would certainly be of the mind to refer it to the relevant committee now at this stage.
Check Brody.
I agree.
John Wilson.
Would be happy to refer it on to the Education Committee.
I think either course of action would be acceptable to me personally. So I think by majority that we think this is a very important petition, and I think we should refer it on to the Education Committee. And can I thank Hugh McMahon and his colleagues for all the effort they put into this. And I know it's not a case of this being lost, but going to the appropriate committee to look at this further. So can I thank Hugh McMahon and his colleagues for all the work that they've carried out. The third current petition is PE 1441 by David Crichton on flood insurance problems. Members have a note by the clerk. I invite contributions from members, and just to highlight that there is some really key decisions to be made by Westminster in the June-July period, where currently they underwrite the insurance industry, who in turn insure people who have properties on floodplains across the UK. Now, there's some debate about whether this renewal will take place, and I know that the Scottish Government has been making representations into this particular situation, but it's extremely worried, particularly with climate change, that we're going to have thousands of people across the country, if this agreement doesn't go ahead, will not have flood insurance. And I'll give you one example. I met a constituent in Murray just the other day who is a major business who will not get flood insurance because she's been flooded twice, cannot sell the business and cannot lease the business to anybody else. It's unlike car insurance, which obviously is a statutory obligation. This is quite a different position, and it is very, very worrying what's going to happen in the longer term. So I just highlight the fact that I think we do need to monitor the progress on this, and clearly the June-July period will be absolutely crucial for us. So my strong suggestion is that we keep this petition open until this crunch period, and obviously keep up to date with what Scottish Government are doing as well.
Can I,
Chip Brody?
I just support that. And I'm aware of the July timetable for this. I mean, having been visiting my family who live in Surrey recently, I see has been no change in terms of the assistance, in fact increased assistance given to local authorities in the Thames Basin. So I think it's right that we monitor this, but also be fairly assertive with the government in ensuring that they seek information that we are not being disadvantaged in relation to what happens now, not just in the Thames Basin, but also in the southwest of the UK.
And just for an update, we were waiting for SEPA to give us some information about this, but we've just had a late paper that members might not have seen. But basically, it's quite positive news that they've had 29 out of 32 local authorities responded, and the 29 who have responded have no constraints or restrictions on SEPA using the data or sharing it through the SVDAD portal. So that's quite good news. So we'll keep members up to date with that.
Sorry, can I just again? Sorry, I'm becoming a bore on this, but I raised this in another committee. 3 local authorities since the 31st of January have not provided information. Do they think we ask for information, or SEPA on our behalf is asking for information just for the sake of having the information? So can we communicate with SEPA? I mean, I don't know, I hear the clerk, but these public bodies, we're here to serve the people of Scotland, find out exactly what is going on, and any public body who's asked for information should at least try and address that as quickly as they possibly can. I understand their constraints, but I don't see why 29 can do it and 32 can't, and 3 can't.
I think Chip Brody makes a good point. You recall at the last meeting, I promised to raise this at the conveners group, which I did. And as What can testify, we were not alone. That other committees have experienced frustration with public bodies such as health boards and local authorities. And I think it's gone up to senior level in the Parliament to see how we can raise this across the piece. So at one level, I'm pleased to tell you that other committees have experienced it only in that they haven't been picking on the Public-Petitions-Committee. But I think Chip Brody makes a good point that we're the public face of the Parliament, and it's ridiculous that public bodies are not responding in time. Can I confirm then that members are agreeable to the course of action identified earlier? Thank you. The fourth current petition is PE 1443 by Maureen Sharkley on behalf of the Scottish Care and Information on Miscarriage on investigating the cause of miscarriage. Members have a note by the clerk and the submissions. I think there's a strong suggestion, I think it was from BMA Scotland, that we write to the Royal College of GPs in Scotland to seek its views, as they're an absolute key body. Are members agreeable with that course of action? Thank you. The fifth current petition is PE 1446 by Dr. Lisa Morton on behalf of the Scottish Adult Congenital Heart Patients on Scottish standards for the care of adult congenital heart patients. Members have a note by the clerk and submission. Can invite contributions from members. Who is Jackie in for? That's the council. Jackie's in for the PM. Right. I think there was a suggestion here that we write to Scottish Government to seek clear responses to the points raised to the petitioner. I think there was unhappiness about that. I think that's a reasonable response in the circumstances. Is that agreed? Thank you. The sixth current petition is PE 1448 by Grant Thompson on improving awareness of the cancer risks in organs transplantation. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. And again, there's a sort of technical suggestion that we write to Professor Forsyth, who's the Scottish Government's lead clinician on organ donation and transplantation, and the chair of the STG, to seek a response to suggestions that further research is required. And again, that's a technical suggestion I think is sensible. Thank you. The next, seventh current petition is PE 1454 by Natalie Robb on hyperemesis specialist nurses. Members are a note by the clerk and submissions. And again, there's a suggestion that we follow up responses from the Royal College of Midwives and the NHS for... Oh, I did come in, I apologise. And ask the Scottish Government to provide responses to the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists. Again, that's a technical response, and I think that makes a bit of sense. Are members agreeable? The eighth current petition is PE 1458 by Peter Chirby on the Register of Interest for members of Scotland's Judiciary. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. I think members will be aware there's been quite a lot of press coverage around this issue, and members will be aware that Lord Gill, who's the Lord President, declined the invite to appear before the committee. Members will know that under the terms of the Scotland Act that we've no power to cite judges to appear before us. We got a very courteous letter from Lord Gill. Clearly, however, it's important for us to get key figures in the judiciary to try and help us see the way through this petition. And I would suggest that we put a courteous letter back re-inviting Lord Gill and also ask him how many judges have been recused and whether there's more detailed evidence on the effectiveness of the current system. I also think we should seek the views of the Judicial Appointments Board for Scotland and the Judicial Complaints Reviewer. And in fact, if members think it's important to have people in front of us, we could well ask the members or representatives of the latter 2 points to attend before us as well. But I know that a number of members have taken quite strong views on this, and I'll start with Chick Brodie and Imbring and Jackson Carroll. Yeah,
thank you, Convener. We've clearly seen the answer from the Lord President. No one said the Scotland Act was perfect. And in this particular instance, it's not. We're all equal before the law, even those who dispense it. I think we should send a courteous letter, but make it very robust in that we now question what, on the basis that, yes, he's written to us, but that doesn't necessarily answer all the questions that we have, and what is there to hide. I'm sure we all want openness and transparency in our Parliament, which is the sovereign Parliament of the Scottish people, and as a member of that constituency, the Lord President, just as anyone else, should at least pay obeisance to a request by this committee on behalf of the Parliament to have him attend. And sincerely he hopes, one would hope, that he reconsiders his position and attends at the earliest opportunity.
Thank you. Jackson Carlow.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, we are not able to compel the Lord President to give evidence, but I would say the Lord President has already set aside that provision by contributing evidence, which he's chosen to do in writing. And I think what we are seeking here to do is to explore that evidence with him further now, orally, which I think it's entirely reasonable for us to do. And I would put an accent on the point that Chick Brodie made, because I think the unintended consequence of his not so doing is to gather support for the petition within the committee in the absence of our being able to establish for ourselves the necessity for the petition or the aims of the petition being progressed. And I think that's unfortunate. And so, yes, I think we really want to try and, as politely as possible, say that whilst the Lord President may not be able himself, with his great erudition and extraordinary intellectual capacity, to be able to anticipate what further advice he might be able to give us that we would find of interest or helpful, that nonetheless is something we might ourselves be able to determine.
That. Are members agreeable to that course of action? So could I just recap for, that we're inviting to Lord Gill and asking him to attend, and we're asking him about how many judges have been recused and whether there's more detailed evidence of the effectiveness of the current system, and we're also going to seek the views of the Judicial Appointments Board for Scotland and the Judicial Complaints Reviewer. Is that agreeable? Thank you. If I move then to the 9th current petition, it's PE 1459 by James Mackey on the total review of coastal erosion protocols and responsibilities. Members have a note by the clerk. As members would have discovered on the reading all the papers, the responses are fairly in broad agreement that what the petitioner seeks is basically unnecessary. Now, the petitioner, in fairness, disagrees with the responses, and I think it is unfortunate, but I personally can't see any other way forward other than to close this petition under Rule 15.7, but I would like to thank the petitioner for all his hard work in creating the petition.
Agree.
Is that agreeable? Agree. Thank you. Move on to the 10th current petition is PE 1460 by Susan Archibald on behalf of the Scottish Parliament Cross-Party Group on Chronic Pain on improvement of services and resources to tackle chronic pain. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. And I think we have Jackie Bailey again to speak briefly on this. Just before I ask Jackie Bailey to say a few points, could I again thank Susan Archibald and Dorothy Grace Elder, who I think is with us today, for their excellent evidence at our previous meeting. And I think it's fair to say that they were less than enthusiastic about the responses that came back from the various public agencies, and I'll say more about that later. But perhaps I'll start by asking Jackie Bailey to say a few points.
Can I just say, Convener, that that's probably the greatest understatement I've heard today. Can I thank the committee for their attention to this petition, and also acknowledge that Jackson Carlow and John Wilson and I are all co-conveners of the cross-party group on chronic pain. So if there's any interest here, it's being shown by the three of us, certainly this afternoon. I think the convener's right. There are substantial concerns about the response from Healthcare Improvement Scotland. I dare to suggest they have failed even to answer some of the committee's pointed questions, and responses haven't been forthcoming. There was a suggestion made by a number of people that the Healthcare Improvement Scotland report into chronic pain and chronic pain services across Scotland has been less than transparent, and I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for Health for acknowledging that. And just one of the examples of the differences that the work of this committee has exposed is that whilst his will claim 75% of pain management services across Scotland, the reality is it's a good 10% lower, it's 64%, and it only exists in 6 out of Scotland's 14 health boards. So we would expect public agencies to provide us with accurate information, and I hope and trust the committee will pursue them for that. But I wonder whether I couldn't just be not slightly mischievous, but actually it gets people to the point. Could we consider inviting his to the committee? Because I think having had one go at writing to them and not getting answers, perhaps having them provide and amplify that with oral evidence in front of the committee might be quite a helpful thing to do. But we're in your hands, Convener.
Thank you for that. I think there was one of the key points that came through was the issue about the residential pain relief centre in Bath, and how, as I understand it, Alec Neil was talking about a similar facility being within Scotland, which I would have thought that's something the Scottish Government would be very proud to develop. And along with the suggestion about HIS, I thought it would actually be quite useful to have Alec Neil or one of his ministerial colleagues to come here and speak directly on this particular issue as well. Can I throw it again over to my colleagues for their views and observations on these suggestions? John Wilson, you look thoughtful.
Thank you, Convener. It's whether the suggestion has been made by Jackie Bailey about inviting his along, a representative of Healthcare Improvement Scotland, and potentially the Minister at the same time, so that we actually get the two of them in the same room answering the same questions. Because I think it would be useful to get clarity from both the Minister and Healthcare Improvement Scotland as to where the direction of travel, because clearly the Cabinet Secretary for Health has indicated a particular route, particularly in terms of residential care in Scotland. The issue is whether or not the Minister and the Government are happy with the responses we've had from Healthcare Improvement Scotland. Clearly, the petitioner and Dorothy Grace-Elder have got to be commended for the responses to the responses so far. I would also suggest to the committee that we write to the Scottish Government asking, and Healthcare Improvement Scotland, asking them to respond specifically to the issues that have been raised by Susan Archibald and Dorothy Grace-Elder, so that we can actually forewarn them if they need any warning of some of the questions that they may be faced with when they come to give evidence at the committee. So it would be useful, as I said, if we could potentially look at getting the Minister as well as Healthcare Improvement Scotland at the same time to answer questions from the committee. But prior to that, ask them to respond in writing to the issues that have been raised by the petitioner and Dorothy Grace-Elder on this issue.
Thank you for that. Are members agreeable to that, or have any contribution? Great, thank you for that. So we'll send Health Improvement Scotland and the Scottish Government the views of the petitioner, get these views back, then get Health Improvement Scotland and Scottish Government Minister to be here before us in a future meeting. Thank you for that. Can I thank Jackie Bailey again? Thank you very much. If I can move on to our final current petition is PE 1463 by Sandra White, William Cleaver and Marion Dyler. On effective thyroid and adrenal testing, diagnosis and treatment. Members are note by the clerk and the submissions. And Elaine Smith is in attendance. Can I ask Elaine Smith if she could introduce her views before we throw open to making some decisions on this petition?
Well, thank you very much, Convener, and thanks for having me at the committee. I did offer in my written submission, if the committee want to take it forward to give official oral evidence. I didn't particularly come along today to do that. I just wanted to hear how it's obviously up to the committee how they want to take the petition forward. And yet, I don't want to say too much more about my own situation. You have my written evidence, and I'm sure the committee have read it. You've also got a lot of other written evidence, but I would make a plea that further work does need to be carried out on this issue. It's not just a health issue, it is an equality issue, because it really does impact very much on women. Some men do suffer from it, but it is mainly excuse me, a women's issue. And I think if you do want to take some further evidence, there are other people in Scotland who might respond to a call for evidence. I'm sure you would get a lot of people who've been suffering. Margaret McGregor, who I mentioned in my letter, has a phone line, and she takes calls from a number of what I'm sure she herself would describe as women in a desperate situation trying to seek help for the condition with misdiagnosis, perhaps on the wrong levels of levothyroxine, for example. You would also maybe be able to invite Dr Anthony Toft along, who is here in Edinburgh, although he's retired from the ERI, he is practising, as I understand, independently as well, because he did want to carry on his work in this field, although he had to retire from the officially from the health service. So I think that if you do decide to carry it on, there's a lot more people you could take evidence from in this country. I would hope you would consider perhaps even doing your own inquiry. I don't know how your timescales are fixed, but if not, then that you would consider referring the issue on either to, for example, Equal Opportunities Committee or the Health Committee to look into the matter further. I don't want to say any more than that. I'm obviously more than happy to answer questions from the committee. Just one final point. The reason I put my own submission in was that when I heard the petitioners giving their evidence, I was struck by the bravery of them coming here to do that, and I felt that really perhaps it was time for me to tell my own story as well, and it was a way for me to do that, and I think hopefully in a positive fashion that helps with this petition. So thank you for having me along today.
And thank Elaine Smith for coming along. Do members have any questions they'd like to put to Elaine Smith? Maureen Watt?
Well, it's not a question, but I'm on thyroxine, so I suppose I should declare an interest in that. And I was very interested in Elaine's condition, and I do think it's something that absolutely should be taken further forward, because I think there are a lot of people suffering in silence at the moment.
Well, there certainly is a recommendation that we write to the Scottish Government recommending the establishment of a short life working group to examine all the available clinical evidence on the treatment of patients suffering from thyroid and adrenal disorders. I think that would certainly make a lot of sense. Are members agreeable with that course of action? Anne McTaggart?
Thanks, Convener. But also, just before we move on to that, just really to thank the petitioners, really from their last session of evidence, I have met more than a few people of which I was able then to refer on, having the knowledge and experience and education that you gave us for that day. So just really to thank them for not just their bravery, but for the knowledge that they imparted that has assisted others.
Thank you for that. John Wilson?
Thank you, Convener, and thank Elaine Smith for coming along and sharing her experience with us as a committee. The issue for me, Convener, would be, while I agree we look at a short-term inquiry into this, is whether or not the committee would be willing to actually take this on board. I know the recommendation that you've made is to ask the Scottish Government to establish a short life working group to look at this issue. But I would be keen, if the Scottish Government aren't prepared to do that, that either we get assurances, because I don't want to pass this petition on to the Health Committee or the Equalities Committee only to find out that they shut it down, because we don't have any recourse then to reopen the petition once they close it. It would be useful if the clerk could speak to the clerks of both the committees to find out whether or not in their timetable they would be able to carry out an inquiry into this issue. If they're not, then I would be keen that this committee carry out its own inquiry, but also get from Elaine Smith the organisations that she's made reference to, so that we can write to them as well to gather further information. And also note that we're looking for responses from the Royal College of Physicians and the World Health Organisation on this issue. So it would be useful to agree, write to the Scottish Government, ask them if they would be minded to set up a short life inquiry. If they're not, then we actually take the opportunity to do that ourselves and find the time to do it.
That's a good sensible point. Other members?
Just in support of that, I think, and I would welcome Elaine's attendance and information, which helps clarify something certainly for me, and I suspect a large number of men have no idea what the implications of this are. I do think that we do, whatever way this working group is set up, that we try and set some sort of short-term timescale on that, because I think this is of critical importance, whether it's we do it or the Scottish Government, but it should be, there should be a timescale set on it.
In summary then, we're writing to the Scottish Government, it's about a short life working group, just to be clear. We're going to write to the two clerks to the other relevant committee, find out what they're doing and feed that back to the next committee to make sure that this inquiry and petition isn't lost, and we'll look at this again in the future. Is that agreeable? Has that covered all the points? I'm going to thank Elaine Smith again for coming along. Thank you very much. So agenda item 6 is school bus safety. So the committee will recall that we proposed to have an event on school bus safety, and members have a note by the clerk. There has been some movement around the Scottish Government's work in this area, and there's a recommendation that we postpone this event pending circulation of a revised plan for consideration at a future meeting. So we're not talking about not going ahead at all with this very important subject. We merely just want to avoid the duplication that's suddenly struck our officials on this. So we'll get back to you with a revised plan, and like you, I'm very, very keen that we do have a major event about this sometime in the future. Okay. John Wilson?
I'm keen to try and set a time scale on this, because this petition has been going on now for some time, and while we had agreed to carry out a parliamentary event to discuss the issue, it would be useful if we could have a timescale set out as to when the government are likely to respond and whether or not, because if we don't have it before the summer recess, then that throws it back to September, October before we could potentially have an event.
Yeah. Well, what we'll do, we'll make sure then that members have a revised timetable as soon as possible to take on board John Wilson's point. Is that agreeable? Yep. As agreed earlier, we are now going to private session for the last two agenda items, and there's no public members there, and if you'd like to join us. So agenda item 7 is tackling child sexual exploitation in Scotland, and the advisor, Dr. Sarah Nelson, has prepared a paper on the second tranche of call for evidence.